name's David Slay. Of course, I'm a ranger here. And tonight I'll be talking about the war in the West, the beginning of the war in the Mississippi Valley. I have enough press about what went on in Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania in the first couple of years of the war, so I'll consider myself equal time tonight. First, we want to talk about the war plan. And the great war plan, the plan that the United States had for bringing the South back into the Union at the beginning of the war, was called the Anaconda Plan. Scott's great snake. You search for it online and come up with variations on this image. Occasional parody image of a snake choking northern generals at their failure to implement this plan, particularly in the East. The plan calls for a blockade of the southern coast. And they were forced to move up and down the Mississippi River, split the Confederacy in two. It called for a strong combined force of about 80,000 men to move down the Mississippi River, leapfrogging Confederate strongholds all the way down to New Orleans. And of course, the Fort St. Philip and other New Orleans would be the culminating battle that would split the Confederacy in two and bring the war to a successful conclusion. There were people who disagreed with this. There were others who had this fantasy, this battle cry, "On to Richmond." That's another one that would become parodied in the newspapers by a hostile press. In 1864, they're still yelling "On to Richmond." In 1865, January 1865, the battle cry is still "On to Richmond." And they tried to fight across this little corridor of land between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, in the entire section of the war, the troops covered hundreds of miles. There were those who were critics of this plan at the beginning of the war, because in order to have a blockade, you actually have to have a navy to blockade the southern coast. And the United States Navy was rather small at the beginning of the war. That's where you have a great deal of faith in your industrial capacity. The North would grow. Also, the naval vessels on the Mississippi River, there weren't many to begin with. I feel like I'm fading out at times with this. And even, of course, the United States Army was rather minuscule at the beginning of the war. Say that it would cost 80,000 men was laughable. Laughed out of the front pages of the newspapers. Insane talk like that. The Anaconda Plan was the master plan. One thing I wanted to clarify is, we're going to talk about this, these different theaters. The Western Theater, Eastern Theater, Trans-Mississippi, and Trans-Pecos. The Eastern Theater is, of course, that corridor from Richmond and Washington, D.C., Shenandoah Valley, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and on the East Coast. Basically areas where the Army of Northern Virginia operated, and coastal defenses on the Carolinas down to Georgia. The Trans-Mississippi is everything west of Vicksburg to about Dallas-Fort Worth area. Beyond Fort Worth, it is Comanche Indians, and a few outlaws and spies operating in that area. Then there's the Trans-Pecos, which is West Texas and beyond. A friend of mine in graduate school is doing his dissertation on the Trans-Pecos. We used to laugh at him and ask him about which of the two people out there he was writing about. In reality, some interesting things are going on out there. Confederates, people before the war were talking about annexing Mexico. Let's not fight each other, let's fight Mexico. We solve this whole slavery issue, we'll just turn Mexico into one big slave country and everyone will be happy. And to show how tone deaf the Confederates were, they appointed the chief proponent for annexation of Mexico as the Confederate diplomat to Mexico. So they weren't real interested in dealing with him. One of the great smuggling ports was down at Matamoros, bringing, you stretching or waving?
No, I'm asking, need to ask a question real quick. I've never thought about this before. Are those terms for the theaters, terms that were developed after the war. I've never heard of trans-Pecos, by the way, but
I've been to school in Texas.
but were those used during the war? I have no idea.
No, you'll hear terms of the West, Army of the West, big armies in the West. Of course, their West is a lot different from our West.
Sure.
The early West, Ohio used to be the old West. There's in this region. One thing I challenge you to do as you become tour guides is to flesh out the role of some of the folks whose voices hasn't been heard a lot in the past. You can bring up folks like Anna, Ella, Carroll, and others. This is 10 about the end of secession. Did you mention much about Kentucky?
No, they didn't decide which side they wanted to be on until
Yeah,
after the war.
that's a problem. Kentucky's like, well, we kind of like both of you, and war's bad for business, so we're just going to remain neutral. April 1861, the Governor Magoffin not sending troops to either side. Early summer. Furthermore, if anybody sends troops into our territory, we're going to go to the other side, use them to keep you out. And this was beyond the Confederacy's wildest dreams. You've got a buffer state that's neutral, covering a good portion of your frontier. That means you've got a neutral zone that you don't have to worry about defending as much. And that is a major problem for Jeff Davis. You see all those charts in the books about comparable wealth, comparable industrial capacity, comparable numbers of military-aged men. There's a huge discrepancy between North and South. Also, the nature of the formation of the South was that it was a union built on disunion. These folks says, no, we don't like how things are going, we're going to form our own country. And at what point does that stop? At what point does folks get tired of Jefferson Davis? Oh, we don't like how you're governing, Jefferson Davis. We're going to form our own anti-Confederacy. And there were some Southern war governors who gave him fits, notably Vance of North Carolina and Brown of Georgia. So that idea of states' rights and individual states having the power can also be a weakness, a very potent weakness. So Davis, when they're coming, the Confederates are coming up with a way to defend their frontiers, defend this new nation. They're going to have to spread their troops out very, very sparsely, because if you leave one area undefended, or you say, well, this area is not as important, then you risk them breaking off or going back into the Union. Davis was faced with a prickly problem at the beginning of the war. So they came up with what historians call the Cordon Defense, C-O-R-D-O-N. And they're going to have a thin line of troops, different strategic areas along the frontiers. So I guess it'd be similar to the opposite of the prevent defense in the NFL. You're not going to trade territory for time. You're going to stop them right at the borders. And if the enemy outnumbers, he already has more troops in the field. They're going to sooner or later find a place where you can't post the troops. They're going to find a thin point. This is going to be made painfully aware to the Confederates in 63 and 64. Once these Union armies break through these outer perimeters and begin to march across the Confederacy at will. This month, the 150th anniversary of Sherman's march across Mississippi. Once they defeated that principal army at Vicksburg, Sherman found out he could march across the state and back without all that much opposition. November 64, after Atlanta, he marches all the way to the Atlantic Ocean to Savannah without any opposition at all. They finally figured out that the Confederacy was a hollow shell. They had more territory than they had men to defend adequately. So having a big buffer state right on your frontier is a blessing to the Confederates. They don't have to work actively to defend. But, this is a little big but, it is also a curse. Because you still got to have some fortifications along that frontier in case Kentucky does go with the Union, or somebody does violate the neutrality. So Confederacy are going to put their principal force defending the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers based on political lines rather than sound military doctrine. So they're going to build their forts closest to the Kentucky line in Tennessee without violating Tennessee's neutrality. And so you end up with a place like Fort Henry that is poorly chosen, is commanded by heights across the way, and in high water it floods. Look good on the map, and in reality it's not a good defensible position. As long as Kentucky is happy and neutral and selling supplies to both sides and smuggling stuff to the Confederacy, everybody in the South is happy. It does give some folks fits. It makes them very nervous because it's like a whole pack of scavengers waiting to pounce on a dead zebra on an African savannah. They're all gathered around. They're all waiting to pounce. You have Union armies poised across the river from Kentucky. You get Confederate armies poised just south of the Tennessee line, waiting on another person to violate the neutrality so they can move in. And none of them trust each other. And one of the principal areas, the most strategic point along the Mississippi River, north of Tennessee, is at Columbus, Kentucky. High bluffs. Unless you mount a lot of cannon, and you can shut that river down. Does it remind you of any other place you've heard of? So that's where it's going to start it. And they are both lusting after that site. And they're both terrified that the other guy's going to get the jump on them and get those heights and control the Mississippi River. Occasionally in the past we've had programs with the Episcopal Church. There's a little plaque in there to a priest general named Leonidas Polk. I always get kind of weird in there because I'm not a big fan of Leonidas Polk's, and I'm about to tell you why. Polk had this philosophy that despite orders from above, he could make his own orders. It was a trait that follows him throughout the war. On the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga, they're waiting on General Polk's corps to attack. They find him kind of having breakfast, being leisurely. Bragg orders an attack, and then what happened to Polk? Gives a Bragg fit. Leonidas Polk is one of the sore spots in that army. That's his ability to stir the pot and cause trouble. He doesn't trust the Union Army. Grant's right across the river with a force from Kentucky, and we've just got to have it. And against orders, Leonidas Polk marches into Columbus, Kentucky, seizes the heights on September 3rd, 1861. And what does that do? Completely throws the entire Confederate war plan into the garbage. Kentucky immediately goes for the Union, invites those Union troops all camped along the rivers to come in and throw the Confederate invaders out. And that is what you call trading a short-term gain for a long-term disability. So just 3 days later, Grant occupies Paducah and Southland, which are at the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The perfect places to launch his campaigns into the heartland of the Confederacy. Of course, the Confederates have an ace in their sleeve. They have Albert Sidney Johnson, Texan, noted for his fighting, and he had probably the best reputation of the fighting general in the entire continental North America. He's out west when the war begins and has to make his way overland into the South. And he's given command of the West. And to this day, historians debate over how great he was or could have been, because we really have no evidence, because he had the misfortune of getting himself killed in the first major battle. It's a good way to preserve your reputation. You have no record to argue about. They will debate back and forth about the brilliance of this man. So he's given charge of all the Confederate forces from the Alleghenies to the Confederate frontier. And it had to be the most rotten job in the world because you don't have enough troops to defend that frontier. You got Union columns probing everywhere, looking for ways to invade the South, and you've got an unworkable war plan, a Cordon Plan. That's you have to have twice as many troops to make it work. You see Ohio River, the northern border of Kentucky, Union troops moving in this direction, Grant crossing here. And of course, they eventually moved down the river. This is going to be the scene of the war, first 6 months. Of course, one of the first battles that takes place out in this, out in the Western Theater is this place called Belmont, Missouri. Of course, Gideon Pillow fought against Grant. Confederates claimed victory. That's the only victory Gideon Pillow ever won, or ever claimed to won. After the battle, after Fort Donelson, jokes about Gideon Pillow getting away, and he was of more value to the United States free and in command of Confederate troops than he was as a prisoner of war. He was that incompetent. It was a small battle. It was very telling. It sets the stage for things that are echo later on. And I'm not going through tacticals on all these battles. What I'm trying to do is show how they will influence Vicksburg later on. And one of the things, the telling points about the Battle of Belmont is there's another general there, and John McClernand, who decides to hold an impromptu campaign rally speech talking about how awesome he was and they were, and that annoyed Grant from the beginning, and revealed a character trait that will follow McClernand all the way through the Vicksburg campaign until he is relieved for a self-congratulatory letter that ended up in the northern newspaper. After the Battle of Belmont, they're going to move in along these rivers into the heartland of Tennessee, the Tennessee River and then later the Cumberland River. They're separated by a distance of about 12 miles at one point, just below the Kentucky line. And that's going to be Grant's first real successes in the war. And what you will see throughout this is names, unfamiliar names that drop by the wayside that are replaced by more familiar names that will become household names by the time they get to Vicksburg. And this, in effect, is you'll see the evolution of Grant's armies, Grant's command structure, and Grant's philosophies as a general. Look at the command staff system. Grant was the foremost general in the war as far as the advances of the staff system. The United States Army is not going to adopt that until later on, after the Prussians reveal how good it works when they defeat the French in the Franco-Prussian War of 1869. But all these characters you see in Grant's staff are very competent, and they put together quite a winning team. You see McClernand here. Wallace is going to drop by the wayside. Smith is going to drop by the wayside. Later, Sherman is going to come to the fore as some of his principal commanders. In February 1862, Grant marches on Fort Henry. The Tennessee River is in flood stage. Union gunboats can pull up to the gun ports themselves and fire on these fortifications. Lloyd Tillman is in charge. We all know who Lloyd Tillman is, or you will by the end of his course. He has a statue where he's dying rather dramatically on our battlefield, but he was actually killed in the Battle of Champion Hill. There's also some artistic license with that statue that will be explained to you later on. He didn't die quite so gloriously. But at the beginning of the war, earthen fortifications were considered unvulnerable. Nothing could take them. And what the Union Army are going to learn during this first year of the war is that these naval vessels, overland going vessels, are able to hold their own against fixed fortifications due to the steam power. Not only float past the fort and float away downriver with steam, they can stay on station in front of the fortification and duke it out with them, or continue to pass in front of those forts fighting. You'll see that come to its fulfillment at Island number 10. Fort Henry proves to be rather anticlimactic. Lloyd Tillman realizes this place is indefensible. He sends most of his troops over to Fort Donelson, remains there with a skeleton crew, and ends up getting captured, surrendering there. And one of the first of many generals Grant adds to his list as the war progresses. Fort Donelson is the main event, February 1862. 11-day operation. Grant has 24,000 and a half men, 14 naval vessels underfoot. Confederates about 13,000. End up losing about 12,300. Most notably, General John B. Floyd and Gideon Pillow managed to pass the buck and get themselves out of the fort, and leaving poor Simon Bolivar Buckner to surrender the fort. You'll never find in United States history a more craven example of people passing the buck. Of course, General John B. Floyd had a good reason in his own mind. He's his former Secretary of War, and a lot of people suspected him of planning for the rebellion by sending arsenals, guns from arsenals into the South, so that when the South succeeded, they would have enough arms locally that they could supply their own armies. So he feared that he might get executed for treason if he is captured. Gideon Pillow was just incompetent anyway, and wanted to save his own skin. And Simon Bolivar Buckner would be the only man of the three with any honor to take responsibility for all the poor enlisted men underneath them and surrender. Simon Bolivar Buckner, his name echoes throughout history. His grandson died in the Pacific during World War II. Look that up. I was doing some research the other night, and I was looking at General Grant's funeral programs, cortege, up in New York. You know where the pallbearers was? Simon Bolivar Buckner and Joseph Edwardson Johnson. Those two. In fact, Simon Bolivar Buckner was one of the last people to visit Grant before he died. Some people thought Grant was rather uncharitable because the nature of the surrender that took place at Fort Donelson, and that Buckner had helped Grant out a long time before the war when Grant was down on his luck, and when Buckner was in a position of weakness and really needed some charity, Grant was rather uncharitable in calling for the unconditional surrender. But as we were discussing on break, Grant was not a very sentimental man. Finding it before Gibson was too pretty to burn, or remembering antebellum deaths in the midst of war. He's there to bring the war to a kind of successful conclusion. He's very pragmatic about it. After the war, he would be more sentimental. In fact, during his dying days, as he was unable to talk because oral cancer had eaten part of his mouth, he had written notes, post-notes we call today, back and forth, communicating with his family and friends. And one of the things he said that really touched him, that he found, he got the most gratification from, was these former Confederates that came to visit him and wrote him letters. And he said, if his pain and suffering could somehow affect reconciliation between the North and South during that era, then it was worth it. We don't hear a lot about stuff like that about Grant, because he was the butcher. Early Lee was the man on the wild horse, the honorable one, and Grant was the crude guy who could only figure out the math. There's a lot of mythology there. Yes, sir.
It's odd, Buckner later became the governor of Kentucky, and he's the one that presided over the Hatfield-McCoy feud and all like that. He was the one that, right in the midst of all that, doing while he was governor.
He was like Forrest Gump, it sounds like.
Yeah.
I bet he felt like that on February 16, 1962. Yes, ma'am.
Was Grant of the whole Union Army at this time?
No, and he's gonna have trouble. And he works for a guy named Old Brains. We all work for somebody at some point who thinks they're the smartest person on the planet. Grant's immediate supervisor actually was considered by many to be the smartest person in the Army. When you have a nickname, Old Brains, that is a compliment. Call my superior Old Brains, but it's not a compliment.
We were noting you were not looking at me.
You have an hour's worth of evidence before I spoke of that.
I'll rumor in my own time.
Yeah, Old Brains. He was considered to be brilliant. And Henry Halleck, John Marslake, and professor up at Mississippi State, wrote an excellent biography of him. Halleck may have been very smart, but he's also very indecisive and not a very good combat leader, as you'll see later when he tries to take Corinth, marching 22 miles in about 25 days. Snell's place, with 120,000 men. If the army had moved any slower, it would have been going backwards. Yeah, Grant captures Fort Henderson and Donelson and becomes famous. This is where the people of the United States kill him with kindness. The newspaper will report about his chomping and smoking of cigars, and for the remainder of his life, he was inundated with cigars. Of course, he died of oral cancer, probably derived from smoking all that many cigars every day, non-stop. He got the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, which tends to play well better in mythology because at Vicksburg it certainly was an unconditional surrender here. But he had the reputation. Of course, there's going to be some immediate fallout because of this. It's going to open up these rivers to invasion. And we're on island number 10 here. Look up there. It's open up the Cumberland River. It's going to lead to the fall of Nashville, one of the principal industrial cities in the South. The South could not afford to lose Nashville. Those of you that are familiar with relics, what is one of the most valuable swords, Confederate swords, that you can own? Anybody got a guess? Nashville Plow Works. You heard that, beating your swords into plowshares. They were doing the opposite at the beginning of the war up in Tennessee. Also, areas of Tennessee are wool-bearing areas, so that's going to affect the uniform production. And it's really going to handicap the Confederates majorly. And that's going to bring almost split the Confederacy in half at that point. They're down on the Tennessee border, southern border, by the end of April.
So, talk about the Confederacy being cut in half by the Mississippi River, but there's only 3 states in the Confederacy on the other side.
Yeah, the real big ones, important ones, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas.
They have as many fighting men as the other side, the east side?
No, but you had major cattle producers, horse producers, and you had that Mexican border towns that were smuggling supplies in. They were blockade runners. You could drop in at Matamoros, run it up the Texas coast to the King Ranch, and make a lot of money and supply the Confederates. So it was of major significance.
David, also supplies were coming over from England and France up into Mexico for the Confederacy
Right.
by rail across Texas and Louisiana.
Yeah.
Railroad cars were ferried across the river, so that part of the Confederacy was vital because of that reason too.
Exactly. Of course, the movement is going to be continuing along the Mississippi River, and on March 2nd, the Confederates evacuate Columbus, Kentucky. So all that about Leonidas Polk getting the jump on the Union Army, getting a strategic point on the Mississippi was all for naught, and one of the biggest blunders of the war for the Confederacy. It contributed mightily to their defeat. So they're left figuring out what to do, how to pick up the pieces. And big plan by Albert Sidney Johnson is what I'm going to do is I'm going to regroup in northern Mississippi, bring all the troops under my command together at Corinth, which will have around 55,000, and then march north from there. Meanwhile, troops are moving along the Mississippi River under John Polk, and from February to April 1862, engages in a reduction of island number 10. Once island number 10 falls, that opens the door to Memphis. Only thing standing between island number 10 and Memphis is the Fort Pillow. And it will eventually be rendered impotent by actions over further east in Tennessee. And I got an image here of the battles at island number 10, and that looks vaguely familiar too. Change some of the terrain over here, this side of the river, and that'll look a lot like Vicksburg. And this is important because they're already learning lessons they are going to apply here. These gunboats, look at those mortar boats, dropping those rounds on the Confederate defenses. They are going to pick up knowledge all along the way. Of course, Polk doesn't pick up a lot because he promptly gets transferred to Northern Virginia and gets his rear end kicked by Robert E. Lee. He's the one that talked about having his brains or whatever in where those headquarters or hindquarters ought to be on his horse. He was bombastic, went out to the Army of the Potomac, blustering and completely offended everyone under his command, and even earned the ridicule of Robert E. Lee. In fact, he was the only general during the war that Robert E. Lee really spoke poorly of. He called him that miscreant. He's always very charitable. Those people, whatever, referred to the Union Army. But he singled out derision for Polk and gave him his comeuppance at Chancellorsville. Of course, the next big event, one of the most important events of the war in the Western Theater, was the Battle of Shiloh. So after those losses, Albert Sidney Johnston's going to concentrate at Corinth, just below the Tennessee line. Grant, after some fits and starts, is going to be ordered down the Tennessee River into from Mississippi, North Alabama. Because right here on this map, you see a cross. Those are railroad crossroads. You go that way, you supply Memphis. You go that way across northern Alabama towards Chattanooga, Charleston. And of course, south there, you get down towards Mobile. It's one of the most important crossroads in the entire Confederacy. Of course, after it falls, as Myra pointed out correctly, the next biggest and most important crossroads in the Confederacy is at Vicksburg, Mississippi. You have the north-south river with a railroad junction on either side. So you got supplies going east and west, and supplies supposedly going north and south. And that river is of most importance to the United States. Not only militarily, but economically. There's a story that Shelley Foote told in that Ken Burns documentary about a soldier from the upper Midwest, Wisconsin area, about getting secession. They can have South Carolina, they can have North Carolina, they can have this and that. And I'll be darned, and use a much more colorful language than I did, if they get the Mississippi River. Because those states, that Old West, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, those farmers in that area depended on international markets in New Orleans by this time. Ship their supplies east-west across the northern tier of the United States was much more expensive than floating down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans. So it's in their economic interest to open up the Mississippi River and bring relief to those farmers in the Midwest. And also, at the beginning of the war, that threat of those states in the Old West branching off and forming their own Confederacy. Lincoln had some political problems of his own about keeping the United States united. And if they hadn't made major progress or shown major efforts at the beginning of the war, that could just satisfy a lot of folks in that part of the United States. They're both under pressure, and they have to make political decisions that are going to a strategic situation. Of course, we're running a little short on time. I'll turn around and look at Tim. But Of course, the Confederates met with disaster at Shiloh. Of course, their battle plan from the very beginning was flawed. As your Union High Command, is old brains himself right here. People talked about how he had an owl-like look and a quizzical way to look at the camera. Grant, Sherman, and Bill. Of course, this is the beginning of the Battle of Shiloh, and what the Confederates did that caused them no amount of problem is rather than having your army, major components of your army, lined up side by side in corps and maybe reserve, they had them stacked. One corps, another corps right behind it, another one behind it. Now the problem with that is as that first wave goes into battle, they get jumbled up. You bring the second wave in, and they get all mixed up. And some of you have masses of troops. You don't know who's in command. They're all mixed together. And these different military units lose their cohesion and your ability to command and control. So as the battle progresses, what you see is commanders just gathering large groups of men. So I'm the highest ranking guy here. Let's attack or do this or that. They were playing like street basketball. They were coming up with a play on their own in the heat of battle. The game's in question. The Confederates, what they wanted to do was push the Union Army away from the river, control that landing, and defeat them at will. What happened is they attacked the Union Army and drove them toward the landing. So when the Union Army in control of that landing, the Union Navy will be able to ferry troops across belonging to General Buell, who had been marching down from Nashville. And that's going to prove the difference the next day. Again, there's this great story of Grant. He had just suffered the worst day of his life, gotten whipped, and everybody is panicking. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Grant's like, we'll look them in the morning. And they did exactly that. This is the Confederate Pantheon. There's the Leonidas. Here, Gustav Toutant Beauregard. And Gary Gallagher has a good saying about him. Later in the war, he dropped Gustav because he thought it sounded too foreign. This is his early hair dye days. He was a rather vain fellow, and once the blockade took hold, his images were he's gray-headed. He's in Miss Clairol or something. Braxton Bragg, some poor fellow on the internet. It was a Braxton Bragg reenactor. It was really sad. He received a lot of criticism because people didn't like his generalship, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky about mid-war. So they made fun of how he looked. Americans do. William Hardy, he was a southern version of Old Brains. You do any kind of reenacting, there's a book called Hardy's Manual. So basically, he copied from the French. The United States renamed it, put Casey's on it because they didn't want their military training manual to have the name of a Confederate general on it. And then, of course, John C. Breckinridge, politician from Kentucky, who probably the greatest feat of the war was getting General Sherman a little tipsy during the surrender and extracting concessions out of him that even Lee could get out of Grant. If you read some of Sherman's biographies, that caused him no amount of consternation. He was the hero of the country one day, and the next day, after everybody read the terms of the Joe Johnston's surrender in North Carolina, he was the GOAT. And Sherman loved the newspapers and press. He never forgave them for calling him crazy. Of course, the prominent feature on the stories of the Battle of Shiloh is the famous Hornet's Nest. His artillerymen are lined up hub to hub, repelling those Confederate attacks. And then Albert Sidney Johnson neglects to take the tourniquet he has in his pouch and cutting off that wound in his leg. It bleeds out into his boot and dies of blood loss during the day. Confederates say, well, you know what? We'll finish this in the morning. So, what I do today, what you can do tomorrow. And they found out why that's a very bad policy. And a lot of people say, what if the Confederates had and continued to push that even. That's debatable too. They were worn out, their troops were in a mess, but that's one of the great what ifs of the war. What happened if the city of Donelson had lived? Who knows? So things go badly the next day. Grant attacks, drives the Confederates from the field. And that's the disposition at the end of the day. Union troops right there at Pittsburgh Landing. Confederates having them blocked in. Union gunboats firing harassing fire all night long, keeping those Confederates awake. Jubilant federal troops, as General BUELL'S troops come into view. And the Union Lexington and Tyler dropping rounds into the Confederate camps. And these two boats were very significant at the beginning of the war because they were the two most powerful boats on the river system at the beginning of the war. So they were able to destroy a lot of Confederate shipping and keep the Confederacy, knock the Confederacy off balance on their naval production along the rivers, and that's something they'll never recover from. Whoever controlled those rivers at the beginning really had a significant advantage. If the Confederates had had an ironclad at the beginning of the war on the Mississippi, they would have moved north and destroyed a lot of northern shipyards and their capacity to build naval vessels. You can't underestimate the
And that is the same A.O. Tyler that was fired on from Fort Hill in January 1861.
People ask, at what point could the war have been negotiated during the first year? At what point did they reach that point of no return? And Shiloh was it. After Shiloh, too much blood had been shed. Too many people had died to call it quits and negotiate things out. Federal losses about 10,000, Union losses 13. Grant and Sherman were castigated. Yes, sir.
So did Buell then use the boats to maneuver around, flank the Confederate positions?
No, they used it just across the river, and they was a glorified pontoon bridge. Launched a frontal attack the next morning, just swept the Confederates before them.
Did Halleck accuse Grant of drinking? Didn't Halleck accuse General Grant of drinking at that
I
campaign?
don't know if he did or not. There's no evidence that Grant was. He was. His problem was that he didn't think the Confederates were anywhere around or a threat. He had his men out there doing drills rather than building fortifications. He writes later on that that they need to be learning how to drill more than they learn how to dig trenches. And of course, he proved wrong. Of course, that famous quote by Sherman after an Ohio officer just telling the rebels out in the woods. Sherman's like, "I'd go back to Ohio if you tell me again." Our careers could have ended right then. They lost that battle. Those two have been fighting Indians up in Minnesota for the rest of their careers. They're relegated to some other theater, like other generals who lost at the beginning of the war. So if they'd gotten a chance to rehabilitate themselves and prove that they were capable commanders.
David?
Yes, sir.
I think that's actually a really good point and has a lot to do with the Vicksburg campaign. Grant was accused by some he was drinking. It was Sherman who came to his defense there. And
Yeah, there's a famous quote later on in Sherman's, "I stuck by you when you were drunk, you stuck by me when I was crazy."
So I think you see that bond beginning
Yeah.
there after Shiloh.
Yeah, I think without Grant, Sherman wouldn't have been the general he was. He needed Grant those first few years. Even after the war, when he felt like Grant turned to the dark side with becoming a politician, Sherman still belonged to Grant that way. Of course, the siege of Corinth takes place in April and May, and that is where Halleck embarks on this blazing blitzkrieg campaign of 22 miles in about a month. He was like the anti-Stonewall Jackson in his foot cavalry. Advanced on a 10-mile front, entrenching every night because terrified the Confederates might jump out of the trees and attack him or something. Get a surprise attack at Shiloh. It left a major impression on him. It took him a little while to get over it. And as a result, they creeped at a snail's pace. But eventually, their numbers proved too much, and the Confederates had to evacuate or sneak out Corinth on the night of May 30th. And again, that is a learning process. You'll see some of the tactics employed at Corinth that will later occur on the battlefield here at Vicksburg. It's a siege, called a siege. These guys learn to dig those ditches, dig those, embark on a siege craft, and that's going to build up 1863. The severing of that railroad across Mississippi makes Memphis pretty much untenable. It's a major supply line, Union armies straddling it. Of course, the naval battle of Memphis on June 6, 1862 seals Memphis, and Memphis is surrendered that same day. And so, June 1862, Corinth has fallen, Memphis has fallen, New Orleans has fallen. And what lies in between that triangle? What's in that triangle? The state of Mississippi. Confederacy, they're going to have a resurgence. Braxton Bragg. I'm one of those folks that thinks Braxton Bragg was actually a pretty decent general. He's the only Confederate in the Western Theater to win a battle. That's a good strike in his favor. But what he did at Corinth was, up to that point, one of his boldest moves in military history. He took a complete army, moved all the way down to the coast by rail, up into central Tennessee and invaded Kentucky. His movement of the Confederate army from Corinth over into Tennessee, up into Kentucky, and that one was the longest military movement by rail in military history. It was bold. And just because of mistakes of a few other commanders in Kentucky, he almost succeeded. He was driven back, and the Kentuckians never forgave him. And eventually, when he was run out of Tennessee and lost Chattanooga, the Tennesseans never forgave him. The critics of Bragg after the war were the Tennesseans and Kentuckians. The folks that served with Bragg at the beginning of the war in Pensacola, those that were with him never turned on him. So when you're looking at Bragg's reputation, you got to look at who it was and what their motivation was. It was hard to argue with success. People love Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson didn't win anything. Hood didn't win anything. Longstreet didn't win anything as an independent commander. They all hate Bragg. On that note, I'm going to let you ask a few questions, and then we'll get out of here before the rain. It's not raining already.
David, isn't it true that part of the reason that New Orleans fell was because there were so many Confederates that had been sent to try to protect the junction at Corinth? And there again, you see the number, they just weren't the numbers there.
If you wanted to sum up the Confederate war strategy, it was robbing Peter to pay Paul. And also there were structural difficulties in the Confederate high command as far as areas of command that built in weaknesses, like the Mississippi River being the boundary between military departments. So if you're commander on one side of the river, you could not act in concert with troops on the other side of the river. That affected Vicksburg a great deal. And probably the best book on that subject is by Stephen Woodward, called Jefferson Davis and His Generals, The Failure of Confederate High Command in the West. All these egos, all these bureaucratic decisions really worked against the Confederacy in the worst way. As you see Grant becoming stronger, developing and building his team, learning these lessons, you see the Confederates moving in the opposite direction as the war progresses, until by 1864 they can't stand each other, and they're embarked on the siege of Chattanooga, and rather than strengthening their army like Grant did at Vicksburg, they're taking them away because they can't get along with each other. You don't conduct a siege by weakening your army. Anyway, another question? Appreciate you coming tonight. We'll be here next week. There's some other members of the city.